I've always believed in the quiet strength of routine. My life with Clara was a steady rhythm. Breakfast at 7, work by 8, home by 6, dinner at 7. She was the kind of woman who filled a room with her presence. Her laughter a melody I'd memorized over 12 years of marriage. We weren't perfect, but we were solid. Or so I thought. It was a Tuesday in late March when the first crack appeared. I'd come home early, a rare treat after a client canceled, and found the house empty. Clara's car wasn't in the driveway, and her usual note on the fridge, out for groceries or meeting Jen for coffee, was absent. I texted her, casual as ever, "Hey, where you at?" No reply. Hours passed, and the silence gnawed at me. By 9, she breezed in, her cheeks flushed, hair slightly mussed, claiming she'd been at a yoga class she'd forgotten to mention. I nodded, accepting it, but something in her eyes, too bright, too quick to look away, stayed with me. That night, as she slept beside me, I stared at the ceiling, replaying her entrance, the faint scent of cologne I didn't recognize clinging to her jacket. I told myself it was nothing. People forget things. People smell like other people sometimes. But the seed was planted, and it grew roots I couldn't ignore. The next morning, I watched her more closely. She moved through our routine with the same grace, but there was a subtle shift. Her phone stayed face down on the counter. Her fingers hesitated before unlocking it. I didn't ask. I didn't want to be that guy, the paranoid husband who doubts every breath his wife takes. Instead, I went to work, sat through meetings, and smiled at colleagues, all while that seed sprouted tendrils of unease. By lunchtime, I couldn't shake it. I called her, just to hear her voice, and she picked up on the 4th ring, breathless. "Oh, just running errands," she said, and I heard a car horn in the background, sharp and unfamiliar. Our town was small, horns were rare. I asked where she was, keeping my tone light. "Just the grocery store," she replied, but her voice trembled at the edges. When I got home that night, the fridge was as empty as it had been that morning. No bags, no receipts. I stood there, staring at the barren shelves, and felt the first real pang of something dark, something I couldn't yet name. Days turned into weeks, and the cracks widened. Clara's excuses piled up like unpaid bills. Late yoga classes, spontaneous lunches with friends I'd never met, a sudden interest in personal time. I started paying attention to the details I'd once overlooked. Her perfume lingering on clothes she hadn't worn around me, the way she'd shower the moment she got home, the faint hum of her phone vibrating in her purse late at night. I wasn't a detective, but I didn't need to be. The evidence was there, screaming in the spaces between her words. One night, I waited until she was asleep and slipped her phone from her nightstand. My hands shook as I bypassed her lock. Our anniversary date, predictable as ever, and scrolled through her messages. There it was, a thread with Mark, a name I didn't know, filled with casual intimacy. "Can't wait to see you. Miss your hands. Same spot tomorrow?" My stomach churned, but I didn't stop. I found photos, nothing explicit, just selfies of her laughing with a man I'd never seen. His arms slung around her shoulders, her eyes sparkling in a way they hadn't for me in years. I put the phone back, my chest tight, and lay awake until dawn, plotting my next move. Knowledge is a brutal thing. Once you have it, you can't unsee it, can't unfeel the weight of it pressing against your ribs. I carried Clara's betrayal like a stone in my pocket, heavy and cold, as I went through the motions of our life. She didn't suspect I knew. How could she? I'd always been the steady one, the one who trusted too much, who forgave too easily. But that man was gone, replaced by someone I barely recognized. I started tracking her, subtle at first. I'd note the mileage on her car before and after her errands, cross-check her stories against the weather or traffic reports, listen for the hitch in her voice when she lied. It wasn't hard to catch her slipping. Clara wasn't as clever as she thought. One afternoon, I followed her. She'd said she was meeting a friend at the mall, but her car turned west instead of east, toward a part of town we rarely visited. I kept my distance, my old pickup blending into the traffic, and watched her pull into a motel parking lot, the kind with flickering neon signs and curtains drawn tight. She didn't see me park across the street, didn't see me watch as she knocked on room 14 and slipped inside. I sat there for an hour, maybe two, staring at that door. A man emerged first, tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair and a swagger that made my fists clench. Mark, I assumed. Then Clara, her hair tousled, her lips curved in a smile I hadn't seen in years. They lingered by her car, his hand brushing her waist, her laughter floating through the air like a taunt. I didn't confront them. Not then. Rage simmered beneath my skin, but I held it back, letting it sharpen my thoughts. Revenge, I decided, wouldn't be loud or impulsive. It would be precise, calculated, a blade honed over time. That night, I smiled at Clara over dinner, asked about her day, and nodded at her lies. She didn't notice the shift in me, the way my eyes lingered on her, studying her like a puzzle I'd already solved. I started planning small steps, nothing drastic yet. I opened a separate bank account, siphoned small amounts from our joint savings, and bought a burner phone. I researched Mark, piecing him together from scraps. Mark Hensley, 38, a contractor with a wife and 2 kids, a man who lived 2 towns over and liked to fish on weekends. Clara wasn't his first affair, I'd bet. She wouldn't be his last. The next week, I tested her. I told her I'd be working late, a lie she accepted without question, and drove to the motel instead. Sure enough, her car was there, parked beside Mark's black SUV. I didn't stay long, just enough to snap photos with the burner phone, the timestamp glowing in the corner. Evidence, I told myself, though I wasn't sure what for yet. Divorce? Blackmail? Something worse? My mind churned with possibilities, each darker than the last. At home, I kept up the charade, kissing her cheek, asking about her yoga class, watching her squirm under the weight of her own deception. I wasn't ready to strike, not yet. I needed more proof, more leverage, more time to let the hurt twist into something useful. Clara thought she was in control, thought she'd outsmarted me. She had no idea what was coming. Living with Clara became a performance. Every morning, I'd wake up beside her, her warmth a mockery of the life we'd built, and play my part. I'd pour her coffee, kiss her forehead, and ask about her plans, all while the images from her phone and the motel burned behind my eyes. She'd ramble about her day, fake appointments, imaginary friends, and I'd nod, filing every word away. I wasn't just gathering evidence now. I was studying her, learning her weaknesses, her habits, the cracks in her facade. She liked to think she was spontaneous, unpredictable, but she wasn't. She met Mark every Tuesday and Thursday, always between 2 and 4, always at that same seedy motel. She'd shower right after, scrub away the evidence, and spritz herself with the lavender perfume she thought I loved. She didn't know I'd started hating that scent, associating it with her lies. I dug deeper into Mark Hensley. The internet was a treasure trove, social media profiles, local news clippings, even a fishing forum where he bragged about his latest catch. He was married to a woman named Rachel, a nurse who posted family photos with captions like, "Blessed and my crew." Their kids were young, maybe 5 and 7, gap-toothed and grinning in matching Halloween costumes. I wondered if Rachel knew, if she sensed the same emptiness I had. Part of me wanted to tell her, to shatter their lives like Clara had shattered mine, but I held back. That would be too quick, too easy. I wanted Mark to suffer, not just his marriage to crumble. I wanted him to feel the slow, suffocating dread I'd lived with for weeks. So I kept digging, finding his routines, his contracts, his favorite bar. Knowledge was power, and I was arming myself with it. At home, I started planting seeds of my own. I'd mention offhand things. "Heard there's a bug going around. You feeling okay?" Watching her flinch, wondering if I'd noticed her flushed cheeks or the faint bruise on her neck she'd tried to hide with makeup. I'd leave my phone unlocked on the counter, baiting her to check it, knowing she'd find nothing but work emails and grocery lists. I wanted her paranoid, off balance, even if she didn't know why. One night, I accidentally dropped a motel receipt I'd forged. Room 14, 2 hours, paid in cash, onto the kitchen floor. She found it, her eyes widening before she handed it back with a shaky laugh. "You keeping secrets now?" she teased. but her voice was thin. I shrugged, said it was from a work trip, and watched her squirm. She didn't sleep that night. I heard her tossing, her breath uneven. Good. Let her wonder. Let her fear. The motel became my obsession. I'd drive by when I knew they'd be there, not to confront them but to refine my plan. I'd park across the street, hidden by dusk, and watch their shadows move behind the curtains. I'd imagine their conversations, their touches, the way Clara might tilt her head the way she used to with me. It wasn't jealousy anymore, it was fuel. I started timing them. 2:17 p.m. arrival. 3:52 p.m. departure. Give or take a few minutes. Clockwork. Predictable. Vulnerable. I bought a small camera, the kind hunters use for trails, and hid it in the bushes near room 14, angled just right. The footage was grainy but clear enough. Clara's car, Mark's SUV, their hurried exits. I saved it all, building a library of their betrayal. I wasn't sure what I'd do with it yet, but it felt like holding a loaded gun, safety still on. Mark's life unraveled in my hands. I found his clients through public records. Small businesses, a few homeowners, nothing fancy. I called one, posing as a potential customer, and got his schedule. Busy mornings, free afternoons. Perfect for Clara. I visited his bar one night, a dive called the Rusty Anchor, and sat in the corner nursing a beer. He was there, laughing with buddies, his wedding ring glinting under the dim lights. I memorized his face. Square jaw, crooked nose, eyes too close together. He didn't notice me, didn't know I existed. That was my advantage. I left before he did, slipping out into the cold, my breath fogging in the air as I imagined his smug grin cracking under pressure I hadn't yet applied. Clara grew jumpier. She'd snap at small things. Spilled coffee, a late bill, then apologized too quickly, her eyes darting to mine for reassurance. I gave it, kept her steady, but I was pulling strings she couldn't see. I'd mention Mark casually, saw a guy named Mark at the hardware store, seemed nice, and watch her freeze, her fork hovering midair. She'd recover, mumble something vague, but the fear was there, flickering. I didn't push too hard. I wanted her to unravel slowly, thread by thread. At night, I'd lie awake, plotting. The revenge was taking shape, a beast with teeth, and I fed it with every lie she told, every secret I uncovered. Time sharpened my edges. I wasn't the man Clara married anymore, soft-spoken, trusting, content. I was something else, something harder, forged in the heat of her deceit. I kept up the facade at home, but my days were consumed with preparation. I rented a storage unit under a fake name, paid cash, and started moving things there. Documents, cash, the camera footage, anything I didn't want her to find. I didn't know when I'd need it, but I'd be ready. I tracked Mark's movements more closely, following him from job sites to the bar, noting his habits. He smoked menthols, drank whiskey neat, tipped poorly. His wife, Rachel, worked nights at the hospital, leaving him free to roam. I wondered if Clara knew she was sharing him with a family, if she cared. Probably not. She'd always been good at compartmentalizing, work Clara, wife Clara, and now it seemed lover Clara. The footage from the motel piled up. I'd watch it late at night, the glow of my laptop the only light in our basement. Clara's laughter, Mark's hand on her back, the way they'd glance around before slipping inside. It was a ritual, their own twisted routine. I started editing it, clipping the best moments, syncing them to a timeline. I wasn't an expert, but I learned fast, fueled by a quiet fury that never slept. I imagined showing it to Rachel, to Mark's clients, to Clara's friends, but that wasn't enough. Exposure was too simple, too fleeting. I wanted ruin, deep, lasting, the kind that hollows you out and leaves nothing behind. So I kept digging, kept planning, kept smiling at Clara over breakfast while the beast in me grew. One evening, I pushed the game further. I told Clara I'd run into an old friend who'd seen her at the motel, said he thought it was you anyway, and watched her face drain of color. She stammered, said it must have been someone else, that she'd never been there. I let it drop, but the seed was planted, and it took root in her. She started checking the windows, locking the doors twice, her phone glued to her hand. She thought she was safe, thought I was still the fool she'd married. She was wrong. I had the footage, the knowledge, the will. All I needed was the perfect moment, and it was coming slowly, surely, like a storm gathering on the horizon. The air in our house thickened with tension, though Clara didn't know why. She sensed something. My silences were too heavy, my smiles too practiced, but she couldn't place it. I'd become a shadow of myself, moving through our life with a purpose she couldn't see. My storage unit was filling up. Hard drives with motel footage, printed screenshots, a notebook where I logged every lie she told me. I'd started tailing Mark more aggressively, learning his world. His wife, Rachel, posted about a promotion on social media, longer shifts, more nights away. It explained his freedom, his arrogance. I saw him at the Rusty Anchor again, flirting with a waitress while his buddies cheered him on. He was a man who thought he owned everything, his family, his affairs, his secrets. I proved him wrong. I began testing Clara's limits, pushing her to see how far she'd bend before breaking. One night, I left the burner phone on the kitchen counter, its screen flashing with a fake text, "Meet me at 14 tomorrow." She saw it when she came down for water, her breath catching as she stared. I walked in, casual as ever, and snatched it up. "Work stuff," I said, pocketing it. She nodded, but her hands trembled as she poured her glass. I didn't stop there. I'd mentioned the motel in passing. "Drove by that place on Route 9 today, looks rough." And watch her squirm, her excuses piling up like leaves in a storm. She was unraveling, and I was the wind. At night, she'd cling to me in bed, her touch desperate, as if she could anchor herself to the husband she thought she still had. I let her, but my mind was elsewhere, plotting. Mark's life offered more threads to pull. I found his fishing spot, a quiet lake an hour away, through his forum posts. I drove there one weekend, pretending to fish while I watched him from a distance. He drank beer, laughed loud, oblivious to me. I snapped photos, noted his truck's license plate, memorized the way he moved. Back home, I cross-referenced his clients with local businesses, finding a pattern. He underbid competitors, skimped on materials, pocketed the difference. It wasn't enough to ruin him yet, but it was a start. I kept every scrap, building a dossier that grew heavier each day. Clara thought she was the only one with secrets. She had no idea how deep mine ran. Clara's paranoia bloomed. She'd double-check her phone, lock it with a new code I hadn't cracked yet, and glance at me like I was a stranger. I didn't mind. I wanted her off balance, teetering on the edge of her own guilt. I escalated my game, leaving subtle traps. One morning, I forgot a printed motel receipt. Fake, of course. Tucked into a book she liked. She found it, her gasp audible from the kitchen. I walked in as she shoved it back, her face pale. "What's wrong?" I asked, all innocence. She stammered about a spider, and I let it go, but the fear stayed in her eyes. I started coming home at odd hours, claiming work ran late, then watching from a distance as she left for the motel. She didn't suspect I was tracking her car with a cheap GPS I'd hidden in the wheel well. The data piled up, dates, times, miles, another layer in my arsenal. Mark's world was cracking too, though he didn't know it. I'd started calling his clients, posing as a concerned neighbor, dropping hints about shoddy work. Heard that deck he built collapsed. Lucky no one got hurt. Word spread slow, but it spread. I saw him at the bar one night, quieter than usual, nursing his drink alone. His buddies were gone. Maybe they'd heard the rumors too. I smiled into my beer, knowing I'd planted the seeds. At home, I kept Clara guessing. I'd hum tunes she didn't recognize, leave vague notes. Back late, don't wait up, and watch her scramble to fill the blanks. She'd ask questions, her voice tight, and I'd answer with half-truths, letting her imagination do the rest. She thought she was losing me to something, work, maybe another woman, and the irony wasn't lost on me. The storage unit became my sanctuary. I'd sit there late at night, surrounded by evidence, refining my plan. I'd edited the motel footage into a tight reel. Clara and Mark, undeniable, time-stamped. I burned copies to discs, labeled them with dates, and locked them in a fireproof box. I wasn't ready to use it, but the weight of it steadied me. I started drafting letters, anonymous, typed, to Rachel, to Mark's clients, to Clara's coworkers. Not to send yet, just to have. Each word was a brick in the wall I was building, a wall that would trap them both when it fell. Clara slept beside me each night, oblivious, her breath soft while mine burned with purpose. Time bent under the weight of my obsession. Days blurred into nights, and I lived two lives. The husband Clara saw, steady and unassuming, and the man I'd become, relentless and unseen. I followed Mark to a job site one morning, a half-built house on the edge of town. He was sloppy, tools scattered, corners cut, a beer can tucked behind a beam. I took photos, added them to the pile. Later, I called the homeowner, my voice disguised with a cheap app, warning about Mark's reputation. Check his work before you pay. I didn't care if they believed me. Doubt was enough. At home, Clara's routines shifted. She'd leave earlier, come back later, her excuses flimsier. I let her think I didn't notice, let her drown in her own lies. The GPS tracked her to the motel, to a coffee shop, once to Mark's house when Rachel was at work. I logged it all, my notebook a map of her betrayal. I started leaving bigger hints. One night, I played the motel footage's audio, muted video, just their voices, on my laptop while she was in the next room. Her laughter, Mark's low murmur, the creak of a bed. I stopped it when she walked in, feigning a yawn. "Old work call," I said, shutting the screen. Her eyes darted, but she didn't ask. She couldn't, not without tipping her hand. I saw the strain in her, the way she'd bite her lip, check her reflection for flaws I'd already catalogued. She was fraying and I was the scissors. Mark, too, was slipping. I'd overheard him at the bar, griping about lost jobs, a fight with Rachel. She's on my case all the time. I smiled into the shadows, knowing I'd lit the match. The plan solidified. Exposure wasn't enough, they'd survive that, spin it, move on. I wanted their lives dismantled, piece by piece, until they had nothing left to hold. I drafted a letter to Rachel, detailed but anonymous, with timestamps and photos. I wrote another to Mark's biggest client, attaching evidence of his shortcuts. For Clara, I planned something personal, a slow bleed, not a quick cut. I'd wait for the right moment when she felt safest, then pull the rug out. The storage unit hummed with my secrets, a vault of vengeance I tended like a garden. Each night, I kissed Clara goodnight, my lips cold, and dreamed of the storm I'd unleash. Clara's cracks widened. She'd forget her lies mid-sentence, trail off when I asked simple questions. "How was yoga?" Her eyes glassy with panic. I fed it, subtle but constant. I'd leave the GPS app open on my phone, let her glimpse the map before I swiped it away. "Just checking traffic," I'd say, and she'd nod too fast. I stopped touching her, not out of disgust but strategy. Let her wonder, let her miss what she'd thrown away. She'd reach for me in bed, tentative, and I'd roll over, feigning sleep. Her sighs filled the dark, heavy with guilt she couldn't name. I tracked her to the motel again, watched Mark's SUV pull in, and added the footage to my collection. The camera caught her face this time, clear and unguarded. A smile I hadn't seen in years fueled me. Mark's world teetered. I'd sent the first letter to a client and signed, hinting at his sloppy work. Days later, I saw him at the bar, yelling into his phone, face red. "I don't know who's spreading this crap." I sipped my drink, invisible in the crowd, and felt the first thrill of victory. Rachel's social media went quiet. No more family photos, just vague posts about tough days. I hadn't sent her letter yet. I was saving it, letting Mark dig his own grave first. At home, I upped the pressure on Clara. I'd mention Mark's name in passing. "Guy at work knows a contractor named Mark, sounds like a jerk," and watch her flinch, her fork clattering against her plate. She'd recover, but the damage lingered, a bruise beneath her skin. The storage unit was my war room now. I'd spend hours there, sorting evidence, writing scripts for the endgame. I decided, Mark would lose his business, his family, his pride. Clara would lose more, her comfort, her identity, the life she'd taken for granted. I bought a second burner phone, recorded a call between them I'd faked with voice clips from the footage. Miss you, baby. Her voice? Can't wait. His, and saved it. It wasn't perfect, but it'd do. I imagined playing it for Rachel, for Clara's sister, for our neighbors. Not yet, but soon. Each night, I'd lock the unit, drive home, and slip into bed beside her, my heart a drumbeat of anticipation. The end was near. I could taste it, sharp and bitter. Clara's lies grew sloppy. She'd say she was at the gym, but her workout clothes stayed folded in the drawer. I didn't call her out. I didn't need to. The GPS told me everything, mapping her to the motel, to Mark Street, to places I didn't bother naming. I followed her once, saw them in his truck, her head on his shoulder, his hand on her thigh. I snapped a photo, added it to the pile. She came home that night, humming, and I smiled at her, asked about her day. She rambled about a friend, her voice too high, and I nodded, letting her dig deeper. She didn't see the storm brewing, didn't feel the ground shifting beneath her. Mark's collapse accelerated. Another client dropped him. I'd sent a second letter, this one with photos of his shoddy work. He was at the bar every night now, alone, his swagger gone. I overheard him muttering about money, about Rachel asking questions. I'd mailed her letter that morning, a thick envelope with timestamps, motel stills, a USB of the footage. No note, just the raw truth. I pictured her opening it, her world cracking open, and felt a cold satisfaction. Clara sensed something too. She'd stare at me across the table, her eyes searching, but I gave her nothing. I'd stopped leaving hints, stopped playing games. The trap was set. All I had to do was spring it. I moved the last of my savings to the secret account, packed a bag in the storage unit, clothes, cash, essentials. I wasn't leaving yet, but I'd be ready. That night, I cooked dinner, her favorite, pasta with shrimp, and watched her eat, her hands unsteady. I asked about her plans for tomorrow, casual as ever, and she mumbled about errands. I knew she'd meet Mark. The GPS would confirm it. I smiled, poured her wine, and let her relax into the illusion of safety. In the basement, I finalized the real 10 minutes of Clara and Mark, undeniable, devastating. I burned it to a disk, labeled it for you, and tucked it into my jacket. Tomorrow I'd strike, not with shouts or tears, but with precision. A blade slipped between their ribs. They'd built this ruin together. I'd make sure they felt every piece fall. Morning broke with a deceptive calm. Clara moved through the kitchen like a ghost, her coffee untouched, her eyes flicking to me then away. I played my role, kissed her cheek, wished her a good day, and left for work. She didn't know I'd taken the day off, didn't know I'd parked 2 streets over, watching as she pulled out at 1:45 p.m., right on schedule. The GPS pinged her route, straight to the motel. I drove to the storage unit instead, my hands steady as I gathered the tools of her undoing. The disc, the letters, a printed list of every lie she'd told me since March. I'd added a new touch, a photo of her and Mark from the truck, blown up to 8 by 10, her smile a taunt. I slipped it all into a manila envelope, unmarked, and drove to the motel. Her car was there, parked beside Mark's SUV, the curtains of room 14 drawn tight. I didn't linger, just slid the envelope under the door, knocked twice, and walked away. Let them find it. Let them wonder. I went home, waited. Clara stumbled in at 4:37 p.m., her face ashen, her purse clutched like a shield. "You okay?" I asked, all concern. She nodded too fast, mumbled about a headache, and disappeared upstairs. I heard the shower run, longer than usual, the water a futile attempt to wash away what she'd seen. She didn't know I'd kept copies, didn't know this was just the opening act. Downstairs, I checked my burner phone. Rachel had texted back, a single word, "Thanks." Mark's world was burning now. I'd seen his truck peel out of the motel lot earlier, tires screeching. Clara came down later, her eyes red, and tried to talk, small, meaningless things about dinner, the weather. I let her ramble, my silence a wall she couldn't climb. She went to bed early, claiming exhaustion, and I sat in the dark, savoring the chaos I'd unleashed. The next day, I pushed harder. I left the house before she woke, dropped another envelope, this one with the disc, into our mailbox, addressed to her in block letters. I watched from the street as she retrieved it, her hands shaking as she tore it open. She didn't play it then. She shoved it into her purse and drove off, probably to Mark. I followed at a distance, saw her pull into his driveway. Rachel's car was gone. Night shift again, or maybe she'd left him. Clara banged on his door, frantic, and he let her in. I didn't stay. I didn't need to. The disc would do its work, their voices echoing in that house, a mirror to their ruin. I went to the storage unit, added notes to my log, and waited for the fallout. Clara came home late, her hair wild, her makeup streaked. She didn't look at me, just muttered about traffic and collapsed onto the couch. I asked if she wanted tea, my voice soft, and she flinched like I'd shouted. "No, I'm fine," she snapped, then softened, forcing a smile. I nodded, left her there, and checked the GPS. 3 hours at Mark's, no motel today. Something had shifted. The disc had hit its mark. Upstairs, I heard her pacing, her phone buzzing unanswered. I imagined her listening to it again. Mark's low murmur, her own laughter, the creak of that bed. She didn't come to bed that night. Slept on the couch, curled tight, a stranger in our home. I lay awake, plotting the next strike, the beast in me restless. Morning brought confirmation. Rachel posted online, a single line. Some truths cut deeper than knives. No photos, no tags, but I knew. Mark's barstool was empty that night. I checked. The waitress said he hadn't shown, that he'd been off lately. I smiled into my beer, knowing I'd cracked him. Clara was quieter, her lies abandoned. She didn't leave the house, didn't text, just stared at the TV with unseeing eyes. I cooked breakfast, set a plate in front of her, and watched her push it away. "Not hungry?" I asked. She shook her head, her fingers twisting in her lap. I left her there, went to the basement, and pulled up the footage on my laptop. New clips from the camera, her last visit to Mark's house. I edited them in, burned a fresh disc, and labeled it Part 2. This one I'd send to her sister, Jen, who'd always liked me, who'd see Clara for what she was. I mailed it that afternoon, no return address, and waited. Jen called Clara that night. I heard the ring, the muffled argument through the floor. Clara's voice rose, cracked, then fell silent. She came upstairs after, her face a mask, and asked if I'd talked to Jen. "Not lately," I said, truthful enough. She nodded, but doubt flickered in her eyes. I let it sit, let it fester. Mark's life was crumbling. Rachel had kicked him out, a neighbor posted, and Clara's was next. I'd dismantle her world one piece at a time, let her feel the weight of every choice she'd made. The storage unit held my arsenal, and I was far from done. Clara stopped pretending. No more yoga excuses, no more errands. She barely left the house, just drifted from room to room like a shadow. Jen's call had broken something. Clara wouldn't say what, but I heard her sobbing in the bathroom later, the door locked. I didn't comfort her. I'd mailed another disc, to her boss this time, a stern woman who'd fire her for less. The fallout would come soon. I'd wait. Mark's ruin was nearly complete. I'd sent letters to his last clients, photos of his work paired with anonymous complaints. His truck sat untouched in his driveway, dust gathering, a for sale sign in his yard. Rachel had taken the kids to her parents, a friend posted. He was alone now, hollowed out, and I wasn't finished. I turned up the heat on Clara. I left the GPS app open on the counter, her motel trips highlighted, and walked away. She found it, gasped, and confronted me that night. "What's this?" she demanded, her voice shrill. I shrugged, calm as ever. "Just tracking my runs." "Why? Something wrong?" She froze, her bluff called, and backed off, muttering about migraines. I smiled when she turned away, knowing she'd seen the truth. The next day, I accidentally played the footage audio again. Louder this time, her voice clear, while she was in the kitchen. She dropped a glass, the shatter echoing, and stared at me wild-eyed. "What was that?" she whispered. "Old recording," I said, shutting the laptop. She didn't push, but the terror in her stayed, a guest that wouldn't leave. I visited the storage unit, added the latest to my collection. Jen's furious text to Clara, forwarded from a burner I'd hacked into her phone with. "How could you do this to him?" Jen wrote. Clara hadn't replied. I printed it, filed it, and drafted the final blow. A package for our neighbors, the busybodies who'd spread it fast. Photos, clips, a note. "Thought you should know who lives next door. I'd send it tomorrow." Clara's world was shrinking. Her lies a cage she'd built herself. I'd lock the door soon. The endgame arrived quiet, deliberate. Clara barely spoke now, her eyes sunken, her phone silent. She'd quit her job. Her boss called, furious, after the disc, and Jen wouldn't answer her calls. I mailed the neighbor package that morning, watched from the window as Mrs. Carter opened it, her gasp audible through the glass. By noon, whispers spread, cars slowed by our house, eyes peered over fences. Clara noticed, shrank into herself, but didn't ask. She knew. I cooked dinner, set the table, and called her down. She sat, staring at her plate, while I ate, calm and slow. "Rough day?" I asked. She nodded, mute, and I let the silence choke her. Mark's fall was final. His house sold cheap, his truck gone, his name mud in 2 towns. I'd sent a last letter to his fishing buddies with footage of him and Clara. A note. "Your pal's a real catch. They'd ditch him and he'd have nothing." I checked the bar that night. He wasn't there, hadn't been in days. Good. Back home. Clara waited, her voice small. "We need to talk," she said. I nodded, let her spill it. Mark, the motel, months of lies. She cried, begged forgiveness, swore it was over. I listened, blank-faced, then stood. "I know," I said, and walked to the basement. She followed, trembling, as I pulled up the full reel. Every moment, every lie, projected on the wall. She collapsed, sobbing as it played. I didn't yell, didn't touch her, just watched her break. "You did this," I said, and left the room. Upstairs, I packed my bag from the storage unit stash, left the house keys on the counter, and drove away. She'd live with it, the footage, the shame, the empty house. Alone. That was her punishment, worse than any outburst I could have given. I didn't look back. The storage unit was cleared, evidence shredded, burners ditched in a lake. I'd moved my money, rented a place 3 hours away, a small apartment, bare but mine. Clara called once, left a voicemail I deleted unheard. Jen texted me, "I'm sorry, she's a mess," and I didn't reply. The neighbors had spread the story. A friend from town said she'd left, house for sale, no word where. Mark vanished too. Rumor said he'd moved west, broke and alone. I didn't care. Their ruins were theirs to carry. I'd shed mine. I started over, quiet and simple. New job, new routines, no shadows. The beast in me slept, sated by the wreckage I'd left. I'd dismantled them. Clara's comfort, Mark's pride, with patience and precision, not rage. They'd feel it forever. A slow bleed I'd orchestrated from the dark. I didn't regret it. Some nights, I'd sit on my balcony, beer in hand, and feel the weight lift, the air clean. Revenge wasn't loud or fast. It was this cold, complete, final. I was free. They weren't. That was enough.